All in. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to JTeen's November 2019 Professional Development Webinar. We are thrilled today to feature Kelly Whitehead, and I am going to let her do all of the introducing of herself so that she can help you understand a little bit more about her and walk us through her presentation today as well. So without further ado, if you want to share your screen, Kelly.
Great. Start share. Perfect. Share. Great.
There we go.
I'm all shared. Is that good?
Awesome. Perfect. I'm going to mute myself now.
Okay, great. As Erica said, I'm Kelly Whitehead, and thank you all so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. It is not snowing here. It is probably around 70 degrees in Jerusalem, but it is 8 p.m. So today we're going to talk about inclusivity as part of our brand working with Jewish youth of color. So basically what we're going to talk about are different ways you can make the Jews of color in your temple, in your community, because they are there, how to help them feel more welcome. I ask that you hold any questions to the end, to the designated time, so we can get through that. If I am lagging because of the internet here, or there's anything else that's pressing, please just shoot me a message in the inbox. I'm happy to help. Other than that, thank you so much for holding off your questions. So a little bit about myself. Here we go. This is me. I am a first-year rabbinical student here in Jerusalem at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion. But before that, immediately before that, I was the youth engagement specialist at Temple Sinai in Washington, D.C. So there I did 7th through 12th grade programming for the different situations such as the student teacher program, the youth group, as well as I had a shared position with the URJ Camp Harlem in Pennsylvania. And within the last 2 years there, I supervised the CIT program for rising high school seniors. Very familiar with teamwork, and it's what I'm really passionate about. And 2 years ago, I was part of the Union for Reform Judaism's Juvenation Jew of Color Fellowship. So this was a professional development opportunity for Jews of color to learn about themselves, to learn about ourselves, to learn about the world as a whole. And it was really instrumental in me honing in my identity and really understanding that it is okay to be a Jew of color, and that the experiences that I've had within the Jewish community were not acceptable. And part of the reason that I am in rabbinical school in my first year right now is my love for Jewish community. It's my love of the Jewish people, and really my desire to bring systematic change to this community in order to make it a more inclusive place. So what we're going to do today is we're going to start with some definitions, going over some basic ideas, and then hopefully there's some time for personal reflection. So if you have a paper and a pen nearby, or the note app on your phone, that's my personal favorite, just have that near, because in a few minutes towards the end, we're gonna really dive into yourselves and what you have to say. So furthermore, the next hour is intended to give you a foundation upon which you will think about your work with non-dominant groups more broadly, and understand how that work functions within the framework of the Jewish community. Because as Jews, it is essential that we root the work in Torah and the sacred values that we're sharing. And when we planned this meeting many months ago, I just said, okay, November 12th, not knowing that this week's Parsha is Vayera. And in this week's Parsha, we talk about how Abraham opens his tent and how he welcomes in strangers and welcomes in people without even questioning who they are, and showed these angels, now we know, the very best of Jewish hospitality. So it didn't matter where the guests came from. What mattered is that Abraham helped them feel welcome and made them feel at home. And as Jews and as human beings, we are charged with seeing each other as vital and important. And by lowering the barrier to entry, by making it easier to be a part of this tent, everyone can belong. So just like Abraham, our kindness will be our reward. And I want to acknowledge before we get started as well that our work is hard. And I have every intention to push you and to make you think about your own communities and your own programs and initiatives that you have in your communities that can be made more diverse and inclusive of people from a variety of backgrounds. And it might not be easy at times, and honestly, it might even be uncomfortable, And I think that's okay. I think that we here have a space at J-Teen where we can challenge ourselves and grow and make meaningful progress. And if you don't do that for yourself, you have to do it for your teens. Because if you put in the work, your teens will thank you. I can really assure you that. So that being said, who is a Jew of color? Let's start with a basic definition. So a Jew of color is a self-identified term first. It's a pan-ethnic term that is used to self-identify Jews whose family origins are originally in Africa, Asia, Latin American countries. Jews of color may identify as Black, Latinx, Asian American, mixed heritage. It can be biracial, multiracial, whatever identity they prefer. And if for the sake of this presentation and due to several factors, Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews from North African and Arab lands vary in whether or not they self-identify as Jews of color. Yeah. So counting inconsistencies, which is part of the Jew of Color Field Building Initiative led by Alana Kaufman. If you do not know her, I highly recommend you look up her and her work, the Jew of Color Field Building Initiative. So we can approximate, this research came out within this past year, that Jews of color represent at least 12 to 15% of American Jews. 12 to 15%, this is higher than previously, as previously has happened in previous generations. More younger people identify as non-white than older people do. So with each cohort replacement, that means as younger generations become over 18, and the older generations, and those who were older generations are no longer around, so that is what cohort replacement is. The future of American Jewry is diverse. And this 12 to 15% is only for people above the age of 18. And we know that this number will only continue to grow. And if you include people under 18, which the data does not exist, it would be much, much higher. Yeah, so 12 to 15% of the population is, 12 to 15% of the American Jewish population are Jews of color. So this research done by the Counting Inconsistencies, the Jew of Color Field Building Initiative, took different surveys and studies that from different major cities and areas around just the United States, and together through some pretty intense research, they got to this 12 to 15% number. So these are the data for only specific areas. And it's divided by percentage of Jews of color versus percentage of Jewish households with people of color in them, which I think is an important distinction, because often you're working with teens who are people of color, and then you could have teens of a dominant group or non-dominant group. You don't know what their household, like you may know what their household looks like, but that data can vary. So for the sake of this presentation, we are talking about Jews of color. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so as I was saying earlier, by birth cohort, the percentage of Jews of color has risen consistently. And this number will only continue to grow, and racial diversity will increase and replace the more homogeneous groups. So we're going to get into some definitions. I'm happy to send you the link out for this data. So, oops, I went too far. Colorblindness. Colorblindness is the racial ideology that teaches the best way to end discrimination is by treating individuals as equally as possible without regard to race, culture, or ethnicity. And in reality, ignoring the identity of others, who they are, and what they have been through is really challenging. So for example, saying, I don't see color, that takes away from the reality of what they've been through. You can't take the color of your skin off, and by saying you don't see color, you're delegitimizing the racism that person may have experienced. And colorblindness is a really problematic way that people navigate through life. So saying, oh, I don't care if you're white or black or purple or green. For people like me, people who are black, that can be really challenging, because from my experience as a black person is different. And I want to acknowledge that what I have been through may not be what you have been through. Racism. Just to get it out of the way, racism is a systematic, historical, and social construct that penetrates every aspect of our personal, institutional, and social life. and it's based on the false social construct of race. Racism is the power to oppress others, both as a group of individuals based on their race. So racism has 4 different levels that matriculate 4 different ways. So individual internalized racism, those are your thoughts. Interpersonal racism, that is the racism that happens in between 2 people. And then there's ideological and cultural racism versus institutional racism. So it starts small with individual, with what a person's thought, to institutional racism. That's racism that comes from not hiring, like hiring practices. That is the broadest that it gets, and the smallest are someone's thoughts and actions. Racism includes prejudice against people of color and attitudes, feelings, and behaviors. And it serves to sow discrimination, suspicion, exclusion, and fear, and or hatred of people of color in order to uphold a system of white supremacy. So racism is a tool used to uphold a system of white supremacy. Now, racism is different than bias. I'll go backwards. Bias has different forms. So there's implicit bias and explicit bias. So explicit bias is the weighted feelings, assumptions, attitudes, or beliefs that one adheres to willingly. While implicit bias is the judgment and or behavior that happens without conscious thought. So it's who you sit next to on a bus. Implicit bias are things that are activated involuntarily without an individual's awareness or control. It is something that you do not actively think about. So an example of that would be microaggressions, which we will define shortly. And just to compare explicit and implicit bias with implicit racism is an individual's utilization of unconscious biases when making judgments about people of color. So implicit racism will be when you actively sit down on a bus, like next to a white person, because you're afraid of that person of color, or there's other, you think they smell, or any other unconscious thought. And when you act upon that, that is implicit racism. So one type of implicit bias that I mentioned, or example of implicit bias, are microaggressions. And microaggressions are really the focus of what I would like to talk about, and something that I think we all can be aware of in our actions, because if we want to make our teens more welcome, we need to be alert to microaggressions. So microaggressions are statements, actions, or incidents regarded as indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group. So they're the constant and continuing reality of slights, insults, invalidations, and indignities that are visited upon marginalized groups by well-intentioned, so this is the key, microaggressions are done often by well-intentioned, moral, decent family members, friends, people in school, your neighbors, your coworkers, your teachers, waiters and waitresses, employers, healthcare professionals, educated, everybody can be perpetrators of microaggressions because they're constant. So this list are microaggressions that maybe some Jews may have faced in their lives. So maybe some of these are familiar, like, oh, you're Jewish? You don't have a big nose. Or, oh, I knew you were Jewish. Look at your nose. Or, do you speak Jewish instead of do you speak Hebrew? Or, oh, you're Jewish, you must be rich. So these are assumptions that are just often used as a way to get to know someone, or when in just conversation, that while they may be seen as kind or innocent, or do you speak Jewish, someone's just trying to get to know you better. But in reality, these are not very welcoming. It shows that maybe a lack of understanding about how a person may feel. So what we're going to do next, I'm going to have a list of, I believe, some commonly heard things by other Jews of color. So how are you Jewish? Where are you from? I get that a lot. Where are you from? And I always say Brooklyn. And people are, no, like, really, where are you from? Because they want to know exactly maybe where, like, my dad was from, or why I don't look like everyone else. But in my experience, I've never witnessed or had someone who is Ashkenazi presenting been asked where are they from, And then when they say, you know, the Holy Land, Brooklyn, or anywhere else, no, really, where are you from? You don't look Jewish. What are you? Just, I've been asked what color I was before by a doctor. Oh, you're not really Black or Asian or Latinx like the rest of them. Oh, you're one of us, as if you can't exist in multiple groups at the same time. Oh, you're really pretty or smart for a Black person, a Latinx, an Asian. Oh, but your voice sounds white, as if this false idea of race affects how we talk. Or in specifically Jewish spaces, oh, I'm surprised you know so much about Jewish or Torah. Like, yes, I'm in rabbinical school. I worked at a synagogue. I grew up in the movement. Like, yes, I do know a lot. So that brings up the assumption that I'm a new member of the community. And for me personally, my most common way that I've been microaggressed is, do you work here? Or other ways of expressing an assumption that a Jew of color is a custodial staff rather than a member or a guest or a different type of employee. So yes, I had worked at the synagogue in DC, but that was someone was looking for the trash or to clean up. And just because I have brown skin does not mean that I'm a custodial staff member. While it is an honor, and I always love the custodial staff where I've worked, I'm honestly quite close to them, it is not, I'm not, I am also Jewish. The assumption is that I'm not Jewish, and the assumption is also is that they're not Jewish. And I can only speak from my own experiences. That is something that I wanted to start with, and I want to emphasize, is as a Jew of color, I cannot speak for all Jews of color. I can only speak from my own experience, and yes, I've had training about working with youth professionals on how to interact with Jews of color. I cannot tell you exactly what to say to this specific teen, because a lot of what happens is very situation based and very up to you knowing your teen and you knowing your community. And we're going to get into that a little bit later, what exactly to do in a specific situation. And intention versus impact. So what I listed in more, they feel welcoming to the person saying them, but they make our teens and adults of color feel as if they have to prove themselves to belong. By asking someone, oh, what are you? Where are you really from? Well, that's welcoming. It makes me feel like I have to prove myself to be part of the community. It's like, okay, here, when you're handing someone a prayer book and you're saying, okay, you open it and you read it from right to left, and you wouldn't say that to everyone, it makes me feel like I have to say, oh, I know, as if I wouldn't know already. By when you're welcoming someone, truly, we have to think about what our words are and how they might be taken. It takes patience, and it takes a lot of time to learn how we welcome people into our tent, which is a part of our tradition. So it's, yes, we can be welcoming, but the real question is, how are we going to be welcoming? So some good openers to start with. So if, let's say, you're at an ONEG, you're at a pro store, you're at a community, and you'll say to someone, oh, we haven't met before. Have you been coming for a while, or is this your first time? Just broad assumptions that you can say to everyone. That is okay. If someone you don't recognize, you shouldn't be like, oh, here, let me teach you about being Jewish. You should ask these big picture questions so you're not making any assumptions. We haven't met before. Have you been coming for a while, or is this your first time? Like, maybe you're a Friday night crowd and the other person's a Saturday morning crowd. You're not always there at the building all the time. Or maybe this is an event. Did you like the service or the speaker or the food? Or when at an ONEG, maybe you can talk about how this coffee isn't that great, or there's plenty of things to talk about when it comes to food, as a way to start up the conversation, and that can be a good in. Or have you met our rabbi or our education director or our board chair? I'd love to introduce you. So by bringing maybe someone else who might know into the conversation, and you can be their middle person, and that can be really valuable, instead of, where are you from? Or I'm surprised you know so much. These I'm surprised and where are you really from? Those kind of make Jews of color feel othered, and that is not what we want. So this is not only when you're with a teen or your interaction. What I have to say is that it's important when you're near your teen of color and you see other people talking to them, that in that moment you have the power to jump in and make sure that you're there for that teen during that conversation, that the conversation is going in a way that you feel does not other them and makes them feel welcome. So we're going to take a little look at what privilege is before we go in and have some time to reflect about our own experiences in non-dominant groups. So privilege is a system of advantage that gives people from more powerful social groups access to resources, opportunities, and experiences that are denied to and at the expense of others simply because of the groups they belong to. So privilege may be unrecognized by those who have it. The person with privilege may assume that their privilege is earned or is available to everyone, but it's not always the case. And systems of institutional oppression provide a defined group in society access to privilege, while at the same time, this privilege is denied to a targeted group, without any specific action on the part of the individual. So this is privilege, and we're going to work off of a chart of historically included and excluded groups. And after we do that, we'll look at our own advantages and disadvantages that we have experienced within that group. So this is the time where your notebook or your notepad app, your pen, your computer, new tab, whatever you're working on, this is when it'll come in handy. Okay, I'll go back to it. Okay. So this is the activity that we'll do. So we'll take a look at these identities: gender identity, race, religion, economic ability, physical ability, age, and sexual identity, and there can be others. Some others include military status, immigration status, language, anything else that you think is a key part of your identity. And so some historically included groups when it comes to gender identity would be men. Excluded group would be non-binary or women. Race included group would be white people, and people of color would be historically excluded. So I provided some of these examples, and we can take a minute to look at this. So economic ability, historically included groups, people that have been brought in and often have advantages, are people who have more means, and then the historically excluded group have been the have or have-nots. For physical abilities, those who are able-bodied and able-minded, and historically excluded group are those who are living with physical and mental disabilities. For example, age, the system does not always benefit children or elders. And sexual identity, those who are straight tend to be more included than those who are LGBTQIA+. So education level is another example of an other. So if you have a master's degree, if you have a bachelor's, that's more included and you have access to more in life than those who maybe did not finish high school, or those who have finished high school but did not go on to college. So what I would love us to do right now is to take a moment and to look at this chart and to think about and maybe write down where you find yourself included versus excluded. This is not a point system. This is not a game, and we're not trying to see who is the most excluded. I know I can find that people love suffering Olympics, especially in rabbinical school. It's a real fun game for us to play as Jews, because we've suffered and we've survived, and that's beautiful. And that's not what we're talking about right now. What we really want to do is take a look and see where you have felt that you have been excluded and where you felt that you have historically been included. So take a minute and write that down. Just identifying where you fall along these groups, and even if you have another one, you can write that down as well. So now that maybe you started with your list, I want you to think about where your identity has provided advantages in your life. So where being a woman may have come in handy. Maybe you've operated in spaces where you've been white, or where you're white. Where has that been an advantage to you? Where has it been disadvantaged that you're Jewish? For example, maybe that there is an an election or important event that you want to go to, but it's on a Jewish holiday, because that is the system that we're a part of, is a Christian system. So that would be a disadvantage. So an advantage of being white is not being, for example, you're able to interact with the police without being stopped regularly. So that's an advantage. So if you come up with disadvantages, that's fine too. We're going to just do that next. So think of advantages that you've had within these historically included groups, or even an advantage that you've had by being a woman in this excluded group. If you haven't moved on, let's think about some disadvantage that you have faced by being in these historically excluded groups. If you are in any of them, or maybe a disadvantage to being in a historically included group. Give you another 30 seconds. Is that okay? Okay, great. So now I would like to open it up a little bit, and I want us to think about how it felt to make that list, to identify and look on paper, on your app, on your phone, in your head, how it felt to identify those target or non-target groups. So the target and non-target groups are historically included groups and historically excluded groups. So historically included groups are target groups, and historically excluded groups are non-target groups. So this question is, how did it feel to identify where you have been historically included and where you've been historically excluded? So how did it feel to create that list?
Feel free to unmute yourself to participate.
I'd like to share. All right, let me just hold on a second. Hi. So first of all, I it's really interesting what you're saying so far, and I like what you said about the disadvantage Olympics that you play in rabbinical schools. I think that is true for a lot of Jewish organizations. For me, going through this list, it was kind of eye-opening because I didn't see it as so I'm a woman, but I'm also white. So it was odd to go back and forth between these different groups because I found them, all of these different aspects of one's identity, they're all very intertwined with seeing each other. So yes, I did feel like I was part of the woman group, and so that is a like a non-target group. But at the same time, I'm a straight woman who is physically able. So it was weird to go back and forth, and there didn't really seem to be like a, I guess, like, for lack of a better term, like a black and white area there. So it is a kind of a mixed bag, I guess.
Right, thank you for sharing.
I'll share.
Great.
I think I had considered a lot of these identities individually, but didn't consider perhaps the totality of the different identities that I have. So it's interesting to think about, also to think about when some of these identities have given me advantages and when they have had disadvantages, and when I have sort of traded between being a target and a non-target, even among the same identity.
Yeah, I think going along with both what Lindsay and Sarah said, I feel like, first of all, I love how this is laid out. It's so clear when this is not an issue that's very clear, I think, normally, but sort of laying it out like this really does help you understand the complexities of the world around us and how we fit in. And I too am going, back and forth, like, okay, here I'm advantaged and here I'm disadvantaged, and how does that weigh in? And when do I take advantage of being in the included group? And when do I, suffer in the excluded group? So it's kind of interesting to toss all of that around and see how these groups help define the way that we act towards ourselves, towards others in different environments, etc. So this is really helpful.
I also was thinking about the fact that we have the ability to exploit the perceptions of others. And so under what circumstances am I mostly playing this card versus that card? And the amount of power that is implicit in my ability to even think about what I exploit. That and it's interesting. I think sometimes age goes in. I think age can be used in exploiting in both directions, both in included and excluded groups, in particular.
Betsy, when you say exploit, are you talking about intentional conscious, or not intentional unconscious, or sometimes either?
I returned something without a receipt, and it would not have occurred to me that anybody thought I might have stolen it. That is that an example? Does that make sense? Is that because of my age? Is it because of my race? Is it because of my gender? Is it because of the way I speak? Is it because of the way I present? All of those things are things that I may not think about in the moment that I'm doing it, but are privileges which I clearly am using without necessarily it being intentional or manipulative. Like, I'm not trying to get away with it, but I get to get away with it. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes. And it's an advantage, and it's not always earned, and it's not always recognized, and also this is the system that you're a part of, and there's no part, there's nothing you can do to control it because it's the acts of other people around you. This is what happens when you navigate the world, and it's Erica, you comment on the organization of this chart, and I hope it shows that people are made up of multiple identities that exist within each other. So I know within my upbringing there's a lot of hyphens, so it's you're African American, you're like you're an African American. So like first you're something else. You're like a Jewish New Yorker. There's many parts of an identity that can happen. And that we're making our way through this list by hitting different columns, and we can't put one down and for the sake of another. So you can't put down the fact that you're Jewish in a queer space, or it's not like you leave one hat at home for the sake of another. No matter where we go, we always take those identities with us. So it's easy to focus on the benefits of being in the historically included groups, and Betsy, you've even touched on this. What power resides in being in the non-target, the excluded groups? So what power exists in being in the historically excluded groups?
There is power within the Jewish community at being a small minority in a larger Christian world, that we presume things about other Jews. Is that the kind of thing that you're thinking of, Kelly?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so there's power in feeling connected to other women, or being in a queer space and able to like find, if you feel uncomfortable, by creating affinity groups. And affinity groups are really important for your teens if they're a part of non-dominant groups when they're feeling exhausted and overwhelmed, which is true by people from historically included groups. And by creating affinity spaces, those are spaces for people with a shared identity, it gives them a chance to breathe and to relax and to sort of not have to prove themselves, and they're in a way free of certain microaggressions or uncomfortable spaces. What I want to know is how it feels to talk about this. How does it feel to make this list and to think about your unearned advantages and disadvantages? So it's similar to the question, how do you feel to identify them? Now that you've been talking, how does it feel to discuss it? To hear other people in this group share what they've been thinking and share their experiences.
So I have to say, it's interesting what Betty was saying about returning something without a receipt. I had never even considered that situation as being a potentially negative situation. I have to say I'm on the same page. It's not being something that I thought about. So on the one hand, having this conversation is eye-opening. I have to say, to be completely honest, I feel slightly guilty for the groups that I'm a part of that are target groups that I have pretty much zero control over, or relatively little control over. They're not something I earned or worked for. But also eye-opening based on like what you're talking about and the example that Betty gave of not only making me realize things that I already knew, but it bringing up concepts or situations in my life or in the lives of the teams that we're working with that I would have never even thought to be something that would be conflicting. So I guess it's in a positive way, looking forward, just I guess in helping me have more open mind about things that would be challenging or a negative response for some people that maybe wouldn't be the same response for me.
Right. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
I just wanted to share the thought I was thinking about first from the first part of our discussion about what part of the disadvantaged groups or advantage groups that I have really I'm white and I'm a woman, and those are very obvious things. So there's nothing I can do. The other groups, I could nobody knows if I'm straight or gay. Nobody knows if I am Jewish or not Jewish. I think, nobody knows, all sorts of my education level and et cetera. They could guess my age, but I could fall into several different categories. So there is sort of a thing of being, being able to be a little bit fluid in who you are and who you advocate for. I think that part of this conversation is thinking about advocacy for our teens, but also for our friends and acquaintances that, thinking about, if they are in a group that is at disadvantage, what can we do and how more sensitive can we be to their, to their comfort to be in a group together with us, and making other people aware that maybe they shouldn't be asking, they should be asking inclusive questioning rather than exclusive questioning.
Great, thank you so much for sharing.
I think perhaps there's a little fluidity between advantage and disadvantage for an included group, because as I was thinking about it, while I'm in an included group, most of the time it's an advantage, but I could think of times when it has been a disadvantage as well.
Mm-hmm.
Just something I go through.
For sure. Great. So I want to touch upon this feeling of guilt that was mentioned, and my goal is not to make you feel guilty, maybe to make you feel a little bit uncomfortable, but it's not your fault for the way you're born, for the spaces that you inhabit. And what I think that I want the outcome of this presentation is how to use these advantages that you have in order to benefit your teens. So my biggest advice that I offer youth professionals when they're working with Jews of color is to be an upstander. So we teach our teens that to be upstanders in acts of bullying or aggression. So that is contrary to a bystander, which watches bullying and aggression go by, and you're not the victim, you're not the bully, you're someone that is on the side. So if you witness a teen talking to another teen in its language that's not inclusive, or they're making them feel othered, or often maybe it is another member of the community talking to someone of color, and if you can witness that and you can say something, that is very, very helpful for the person you're talking to. Now, I cannot give you a script of what to follow because it is very much up to who you are, as well as the other people, maybe the microaggressor and the victim here, because I know many teens who would be so embarrassed if you interrupted their conversation and scolded someone. Or I also know many adults who they do not learn by saying, hey, you shouldn't say that, that's offensive, because instead they'll shut down. So it's very, very situation based. So I would say there's different ways to be an upstander, and that is not always by jumping in front of the bullet. So one way to do that was if you see a member of the community making someone feel othered, later first checking in on the person who is othered and make sure that they're okay, and maybe apologize for the member of your community's actions. But you don't necessarily have to jump in on the spot. And then going to the aggressor because you see what happened, maybe it wasn't welcoming, and telling them how it made you feel. And by bringing them into the conversation and maybe offering them some resources, which I'll provide at the end, you can help it not happen again. And by being aware and thinking about the ways that you navigate the world and the way you talk to other people, that's another way to help your teens and other people of color feel more welcome in your community. So one way that I mentioned was creating affinity spaces. Maybe there's multiple teens of non-marginalized or marginalized non-dominant groups, that if you are having maybe a long mood, a day of learning, that you can offer a separate classroom for those people who maybe are non-dominant in their identity, but first with their permission. And as a review, avoiding a colorblind mentality by not ignoring what people have systematically been through or their experiences. Don't say, I don't see color. That is very challenging. Or everyone's equal. Yes, everyone is welcome and included, but that was my calendar. We're not always on the same level. There's a difference between equity and equality. Avoid microaggressions and other forms of implicit and explicit bias as often as you can. There's only so much control you can have implicitly, but how are you talking to those members of your community? Where are you sitting? Where are you placing your body, especially your body language? Are you grabbing your purse when you're walking tighter, like when you're walking by a person of color? Are you moving to the other side of the street? Are you, when you're going in for a handshake, fist bumping instead? Like what are these acts that you are doing? Just in general, I'm adding that avoid gender specific language. Please don't say, or I find it's challenging when you're talking to a group and you say, okay, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, you're talking to a group of people who present as as women, and you say, okay, ladies, we're going to do this because you might not know how they identify. That was additional side note that I felt like I had to lead. I had to add, but that's a session for another time. And if you see someone that is using that language, maybe correct and say, hey, friends, we're moving on to the next activity. Hey, like, you all. And avoid assumptions. We don't know what people are. There's many, in this checklist, there's many lists of people that you don't always see where they're from, where they've come from, where they've gone, or what. Not all identities are visible, as you mentioned, so avoid making assumptions about someone's identity. And listen to your teens. Really, please listen to them. They know so much, and I wish I could sit down every one of my rabbinical school classmates with some teens and teach them how to listen to each other and how to view the world in a way that is both optimistic and realistic. And you can also ask Betsy about the power of the teens and how they and how they think. But I miss working with them every day, and I feel like I'm in rabbinical school, and I feel like I'm learning less because I'm no longer around them. So I have some recommended, in the last few minutes, some recommended resources, which I will share. Just some books. These are, I narrowed it down to 4. White Fragility is an incredible book that maybe if you're feeling uncomfortable or don't know how to deal with these emotions, White Fragility is a great way to unpack maybe why white people feel the way that it's like harder for white people to learn how to unlearn these systems. The Price of Whiteness, Jews, Race, and American Identity by Eric Goldstein. Just a very easy read that many teens also read, Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. And Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, and Other Conversations About Race by Beverly Daniel Tatum. I'm a big podcast fan. I love Code Switch, that's by NPR. The Union for Reform Judaism has a number of podcasts, one of which is Holy Jewish. Holy Jewish is a series of podcasts that focuses on, each episode is about a different member of my Juvenation Jew of Color Fellowship. So each episode is about 20 minutes that goes into the different life of different people of color within the specifically Reform, but also a little bit outside Jewish world. And Alana Kaufman, who is fronting the research on Jews of Color and the Jews of Color Field Building Initiative. She has this amazing, I believe it's a TED Talk, it might be an Eli Talk, Who Counts Race in the Jewish Future, that I highly recommend. I'm in Jerusalem through May, and then I'm back in New York, inshallah, for 4 years. And if you need me, have any questions, this is my email. And you can also get in touch with Erica or the rest of the friends at J-Teen if you have any other questions or comments. Happy to answer them another time. Thank you.
Awesome. Maybe we'll take another 2 minutes, 2-3 minutes. If anybody has any additional questions, clarifications, thoughts that they want to pose to the group.
Yeah, I would like Kelly to talk a little bit more about affinity groups. I sort of like, my first reaction was, sort of separating out people into their only specific groups. Is that always a good idea? Like, or how would you go about doing it? What's the value of it?
Yeah, so affinity groups are for people with a shared interest in a goal, and they generally, when talking, I'm gonna take a minute, generally affinity spaces are sort of break rooms and breathers, and this is what I recommend. So affinity spaces, when it comes to learning, can mean different things, but in the context that I'm talking about, it is when you are a part of a larger, I'm gonna say a Jewish space where there's a lot of people who fall into the historically included groups. And by providing rooms for just those people and those people alone allows them to discuss their shared experiences. So it's not for the purpose of maintaining the homogenous identity of the main group. It's for mostly those who are of non-dominant groups to feel a little bit at ease. And it's very much up to it should come from, you can ask people if it's something that they need, but really it should come from those people of non-dominant groups. It has, I know it has like a very, it has connotations of segregation, but it's controlled and it's time limited.
So Judy in the chat asked how you find the balance between the main group and or the dominant group and the minority group.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask that, you know, you don't want to come across as colorblind, but how do you find that balance of being colorblind but not wanting to specifically so point out a difference, you know, that it becomes the elephant in the room?
Yeah, I think it's very situation based. I think that you can, I think it goes back to my argument that you can only make assumptions of what people have been through or what they identify as. So I think that we can bring people in the balance between colorblindness, not colorblindness, that we should make people feel welcome. And it does, you know, equality is not easy. Sometimes it does require a few extra steps to make someone feel a little bit more welcome.
Wonderful. All right. So we have got Kelly's information for any of you, anyone who's live watching today, as well as those who may view the recording after this. Kelly, thank you so much for taking the time to prepare, for spending your evening with us. I'm sure you've got lots of studying to do as soon as you hang up on this call. But we really thank you for your expertise, for your time, for your passion, and for really helping us begin to think about how we think about things and how we engage with all members of our community. You're getting lots of thank yous in the chat as well.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Taking the time. This is very important.
Beautiful. All right. We will see everybody very soon. Lila Tove. Bye-bye.